Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Today, we are going to focus on some different schools of literary criticism. This is how to analyze literature like a professor. So, in the past, in some of your past English classes, you're probably used to analyzing literature, just kind of using your own perspective. And that's great. That's absolutely great. But by studying some different schools of literary criticism, also called literary theory, also called critical theory, a bunch of different names for it, it's going to allow you to interpret texts through different perspectives, not just your own. So this is really going to expand your ability to interpret and analyze literature by knowing some of these different critical theories, some of these different schools of literary criticism. And I know that probably sounds boring and maybe hard or complicated, but I assure you that it is not. It is not. This will give you the tools to analyze literature on a higher level than you have been able to in the past. So, in general, simply put, literary theory is the systematic study of the nature of literature and of the methods for analyzing literature. I'm going to simplify this in just a second. Literary theory and literary criticism in general are concerned primarily with the creation of meaning. So when you read a text, when you watch a movie, when you watch a television show, etc., 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 you have just as big a part to play in the creation of meaning than the creator does, right? The creator creates a piece of work and art with some idea of meaning in mind, and it's kind of up to us, the audience, to interpret that meaning. And that meaning's not always going to be the same meaning that the kind of author had in mind. So we have just as big a part to play when it comes to the creation of meaning in artwork as the author does. So I'll give you guys a second to write that down. Meaning is really not inherent in anything. We are the ones that have to construct it. We're the ones that have to create it. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and move along here. This is kind of the academic definition for literary criticism. I'm going to simplify it in just a second here. So literary theory refers to any principles derived from internal analysis of literary texts or from knowledge external to the text that can be applied in multiple interpretive situations. So simply put, to simplify this quite a bit, literary criticism in general as a body of knowledge are just different schools of thought. Different schools of thought that are going to allow us to interpret literature in multiple different ways. So if we're looking at one singular text, we can provide an interpretation of that singular text using our own perspective. We can provide multiple interpretations of a single text using different schools of thought, different schools of literary criticism. In my humble opinion, I think it's really helpful to view these different schools of thought almost as glasses or lenses. I think that's a really helpful metaphor. When you're interpreting a text using your own perspective, you are wearing your own glasses, the glasses that represent your perspective. When you're using different schools of literary criticism to interpret or analyze a text, you are taking off the glasses of your perspective and putting on glasses of a different perspective. So we kind of have, different sets of lenses that we can put on, analyze that same text in multiple ways. These are going to be terms that you will probably hear in your college English classes, so I'm really hoping this gives you kind of a head start. But again, this first definition here is just kind of the academic fancy way of saying these are different schools of thought that you can use to literature in different ways. That's the simplified definition. And that's going to make a lot more sense once we get into the actual schools themselves. So as you can see from this infographic, there are a ton of different schools of literary criticism, starting from 400 BC, like almost as long as Western literature has been in existence. There has been literary criticism, and it branches off into different schools of thought, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to learn all of these. I'm not going to dump a bunch of abstract stuff on your head and expect you to remember that. We're going to focus on 3 of the main contemporary ones for today, for now, for a while. And then throughout the year, we might add 1, 2, 3 more. And we're going to use these right away, so you're not just sitting on a bunch of abstract theory. Because what use is theory without being able to use it in a practical situation? It's just nonsense at that point. All right, so the very first theory, the very first school of literary criticism that we're going to talk about today is feminist and gender criticism. This is often feminist criticism and gender criticism are considered 2 different schools of thought. For simplicity's sake, to kind of streamline this, because we could spend the whole year talking about all the subtleties and intricacies of the different schools of criticism. To streamline that, we're just going to lump them together. So feminist critics kind of obviously concern themselves primarily with the roles of female characters in works of literature. That's kind of obvious, right? The feminist school of literary criticism asserts that much of our society is innately patriarchal. Do you guys know what that word means? Patriarchal or patriarchy? Has anyone heard that word before? Yeah? What does it mean, basically? You've heard it, just don't necessarily have a specific definition for it in your head. Sure. In general, as you can see here, it essentially means a male-dominated society. Patriarchal means male-dominated. Patriarchy, essentially, simplified definition, male-dominated society. So feminist critics seek to expose sexism and examine the impact of patriarchy on women through literature. We can learn a heck of a lot about the society in which a text was written by studying that text, and specifically, studying that text through a feminist lens. We can learn about the roles of women in a particular society. As I'm sure you know, roles of men and women differ from society to society throughout time. And just a little bit of a disclaimer for those of you who, I don't know, might not like that word. I don't know. I feel like I have to give some kind of a disclaimer. Reading a text through a feminist lens does not make you a feminist, does not make the book a feminist work of literature. We're simply examining the roles of women and sometimes men in society, because men are included as well. But we have a focus on women oftentimes because of the patriarchy, because we have a male-dominated society. It's not quite as bad now as it has been in the past, as you'll see from some of the different texts that we read. So some different ways the patriarchy might take shape in past societies, past literature is, for example, like women used to not be able to own land. Wealth was passed down from father to son in the male line, right? There's really no way for women to own money or have a position of political power. That's one way that the patriarchy might take shape in past societies. So you don't need to write this part down, because I've included all these questions on the document that I posted in Classroom. To make this really easy for you guys, I've come up with some questions here that you can ask yourself while reading a work. If you ask yourself any of these questions and answer them after reading something, you are using the feminist school of thought. Boom, you're using feminist criticism. So we might ask ourselves, how is the relationship between men and women portrayed in that text? What can that tell us about the roles of men and women in a particular society? What are the power relationships between men and women? Who has the power? Who has the power? How are male and female roles defined? What constitutes masculinity and femininity? As I'm sure the roles of men and women differ from society to society. What we would consider male roles or female roles in our society, or what is masculine, what is feminine in our society, might not be the same in, say, Uganda or Chile. Um, just like that, it's going to differ from time period to time period. We're starting out very, very early on in the Anglo-Saxon period, before Britain was even established as a country. Um, we're going to move from that all the way to modern texts, right? Modern Britain. Those roles of men and women, those definitions of masculinity and femininity are going to change throughout history. And we can examine that by using feminist criticism while we are interpreting texts. So how do characters embody these traits? What does the work reveal about the operations of patriarchy economically, politically, socially, psychologically? We kind of just talked about that, right? How, maybe in medieval society, we might examine how, women could not own land and how that affected their agency. We might focus on how they could not hold positions of power and how that limited their political agency. We might talk about, you know, how that affected them psychologically, right? And again, we will focus on men too, because what constitutes masculinity is also important. And considering that most of English canon has been written by men, this will absolutely be relevant. All right. I don't remember if I said this, but we're only focusing on 3 of these today. So here's the next one. And this one is called New Historicism or Cultural Studies. You've probably used this one in the past without necessarily knowing that you are using it. So New Historicism theory is based on the assumption that we cannot interpret a text without an understanding of the social and political movements of the time. So new historicists reject the idea that you can interpret a text accurately with only your own perspective. They say we need that historical context to interpret and analyze any given text. It is perfectly fine and good to use your own perspective, but new historicists would argue that you can't come up with a thorough interpretation or analysis of a work without an understanding of the historical, of the political, of the social movements of that time. So I'm sure in the past, before starting a novel, your English teachers have probably given you some historical context if the text is older. Has that ever happened? Maybe not. So yeah, new historicists assert that one cannot remove a work from the time period in which it was created. The school of thought accepts the necessity of making historical value judgments so we can criticize, we can analyze those historical movements, those political movements, those social movements through literature, through how the author portrays them in literature. So for example, I'm going to use maybe not the best example, but probably a movie that you've probably all seen is like Forrest Gump. Who's all seen Forrest Gump? Okay, so at least 3 out of the 5 of you. So for example, new historicists would argue that you can't really understand Forrest Gump or analyze Forrest Gump's meaning without an understanding of the Vietnam War and the protests that occurred because of the Vietnam War. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like you might be able to get something out of that movie, but you're not going to have a full understanding if you have no idea of what was going on during that time. And considering that we're starting the year off with some older texts, those societies, those cultures are going to be alien to us. So we need to have an understanding of their values, the historical, the political movements of that time to really appreciate, to analyze those texts. Thank you for appreciating that, Jesse. What's the use of including memes if no one laughs at them? All right, moving on. And again, you don't need to write down these questions because they're included in a separate document. So, if we are using new historicism criticism, we might ask ourselves what language, what characters, what events present in the work reflect the current events of the author's day? Pretty simple one. Are there words in the text that have changed their meaning from the time of the writing? We know that language is ever evolving, it does not stay the same. Um, Especially these days, it almost seems like from year to year, the slang that is popularized, the slang that we use, changes from year to year. It's ever evolving. And so if we're reading an older text, there might be a word that we use in the present day, but perhaps its definition has changed. Perhaps the connotation of the word has changed. And so we kind of need to understand that in order to not misconstrue what the author is trying to say, in order to accurately interpret a text. How are historical events interpreted and presented? How are historical events interpretation and presentation a product, a result of the culture of the author? Does the work's presentation, does the text support or condemn that historical, that social, that political event or movement? Can it be seen to do both? So, oftentimes, a historical, a social, a political event is going to motivate an author to, write a story that involves it, right? And so we want to consider, we have to first of all know what that historical event, that political event is, and then we can analyze the literature with the knowledge that we have of that historical, that political event, in order to kind of deduce, hey, is the author condemning that? Is he criticizing that? Or is she praising that? How does this portrayal criticize the leading political figure or movements of the day? So pretty similar to the previous one. How does the work consider traditionally marginalized populations? So, for example, if the work is set in, post-Reconstruction United States, we might want to consider, well, how is the author portraying, for example, African Americans? How is the author portraying Chinese Americans? How is the author portraying any kind of minority group who doesn't necessarily have power in a society? Again, not all of these questions are always going to be relevant, but some of them most likely will be. All right, last one. Marxist criticism. And I feel like I need to offer another disclaimer here because Marx is an extremely polarizing figure. I don't know if you know anything about him. So, using Marxist criticism to analyze or interpret a text does not make you a Marxist, does not make you a communist, does not make you a socialist, whether you think that's a good or a bad thing. It does not make it the text communist, does not make the text socialist or Marxist in any way, shape, or form. They really call this school of thought Marxist because it concerns itself primarily with socioeconomic class. And that's about it. Do we know what socioeconomic class is? Have we heard that term before? No, not really. Well, a simple definition of socioeconomic class is essentially, well, how much money, how much wealth you have, and how does that affect your social standing, right? In the United States today, we have a working class, we have middle class, we have upper class, right? And that is determined by how much money you make, how much wealth you have, and that doesn't only determine like what kind of things you can buy for yourself. That greatly impacts your position in a society, right? So Marxist critics concern themselves primarily with socioeconomic class, who has the power in society, how the lower classes are oppressed by the upper class, etc., etc. So a Marxist critic typically undertakes to explain the literature in any era. It doesn't matter if it's old, if it's new, right? Social classes have existed all throughout history in every single society. That's something that generally doesn't change. even the basic structure remains the same: lower, middle, upper. That might present itself in different forms. For example, medieval period, they might call that serfs or peasants or laborers or farmers, clergy, nobles, king or queen. That's basically just a different format of lower, middle, and upper, right? So that basic structure is going to be present all throughout history. And so Marxist criticism is always going to be relevant when interpreting or analyzing literature. And very last set of questions here. So if we are using Marxist criticism to interpret a text, we might ask ourselves, whom does it benefit if the work or effort is accepted, successful, believed, etc.? So does the work portray the upper class in a positive manner and the lower class in a negative manner, or vice versa? What is the social class of the author? That's going to impact the author's perspective on social class, on socioeconomic class, depending on if the author is working middle or upper, right? Which class does the work claim to represent? What values does it reinforce? What values does it subvert? Despite the fact that society and cultures as a whole have some intersecting values, some commonalities in their values, socioeconomic class is a determinant of what you value, of what your values are, what your morals and ethics are. So does the work reinforce a certain socioeconomic class's values, or does it subvert those values? What conflicts can be seen between the values the work champions and those it portrays? What social classes do the characters represent? That's really the easiest way to use Marxist criticism. That's the easiest one. We just take a look at the characters in the novel. Well, what social classes are these characters? How are these characters portrayed? Are these characters representations of their social class? And how do these characters from different classes interact or conflict with each other? Is the author trying to say something about the socioeconomic structure of that particular society in that particular time through this work of literature? Well, perhaps. That's kind of up to us to find out. All right, so that is the very last set of questions. Again, we're only going over 3 of these schools of literary criticism. We're going to use them right away. Because again, what is abstract theory if you can't use it in a practical manner? So I don't remember if I said this towards the beginning of the period, but you were supposed to receive this lecture yesterday, and you didn't because of my tech issues. So it says on Classroom that this is due Friday for you. That's not the case. It is going to be Tuesday for you. Tomorrow, we'll do some very chill, easy icebreaker stuff so I can get to know you a little bit better. Then I'm going to give you the period to read this text and or work on the exercise that goes along with it. I'll be there to help you out. If you have any confusion, you can do that with partners and stuff. So that's my way of making up to you for the fact that I didn't get this to you yesterday. And so just a couple more slides here. Sorry, don't put away your stuff just yet. I swear there's very minimal writing on these ones. So we'll be using all 3 of these schools of criticism. Sure. What was I going? Oh yeah. In order to use all 3 of these schools of criticism, specifically New Historicism, I have to give you a tiny little bit of historical background about the short story that we're about to read. And again, just also remember, just by asking these questions, you're using that theory. By answering those questions, you're using a particular theory. This is a very easy way to implement and use this theory and analyze literature on a higher level with different perspectives. So, in order to practice interpreting a text using these different schools, you will read the short story The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, written in 1892. This was during the Victorian period. I know that I said that we would start at the very beginning of time, essentially. Not the beginning of time, the beginning of Western literature. But for the sake of practicing, of exercising with these different schools, we're going to use something a little bit more modern. Only 10 pages, very short story. So a few things you should know. It's set in the Victorian period. We will have a unit on Victorianism, on the Victorian period later in the year, so I'm not going to bog you down with a ton of unnecessary details. I'm going to give you the bare minimum that's necessary to understand this particular text. So in the Victorian periods, the roles of women and men, especially upper class women, were deeply ingrained in British society. The roles of men, the roles of women were very rigid. You did not subvert those roles if you wanted to be accepted by British society in Victorian England. So in terms of the woman's role, we're going to focus mainly on that because this story centers around a woman in Victorian England. Women were viewed as passive, non-sexual keepers of the household. Right? That is the role that they are relegated. Sounds somewhat familiar because that role is kind of similar in a lot of Western civilization, with varying degrees of differences. So that's one thing that you'll want to keep in mind. Lastly, as I'm sure that you can imagine, medical science in the Victorian era was not crazy advanced, even though it was but a mere, little over 100 years ago. Even worse than the traditional medical science was their understanding of mental illness, or the workings of the psyche. So their understanding of mental illness was not that great. Our understanding of mental illness has a long ways to go. Their understanding of mental illness was a heck of a lot worse. So there was something implemented called the rest cure in Victorian England. So any emotional outburst, especially among women, was considered a form of mental illness called hysteria. So if a woman had some kind of extreme emotional outburst, whether that be from anger, stress, whatever emotion, they were considered hysterical. You've probably heard that term before, not in a medical context. This is a medical term in Victorian England. They would diagnose you with hysteria. Your emotions are out of control. We need to figure out a way to stabilize you. You have a mental illness. We need to figure out how to stabilize you. I'm sure some of these women who were subjected to the rest cure had mental illness. Some of them probably didn't. But any kind of outburst of emotion was generally considered a form of hysteria. So the rest cure involved isolating a patient from family and friends for about 6 to 8 weeks with very little social interaction, very little mental stimulation, very little physical activity. So I think that you can probably imagine that this wasn't exactly the best remedy to their problems. And for those individuals who actually had a mental illness, what do you think that this might do? Just to predict a little bit. Heck yeah, that sounds like it would exacerbate any form of mental illness. I would say that we have no idea what this is like, but maybe our quarantine was somewhat like the rest cure. Maybe drove us a little bit crazy. So we're going to examine, how that rest cure impacts the narrator. So we have about 5 minutes left. I just want to very briefly run over the worksheet that you guys are going to work on to go along with this assignment so that you're not confused. If you want to get a start on it tonight, that's fine. Again, like I said, tomorrow, you can work on that in class tomorrow if you need my guidance, or if you'd like to collaborate with a partner. I always think collaborative analysis is beneficial. So the short story is only 10 pages long. It was originally published in a newspaper. So that's kind of why the format is like this, kind of weird with that division down the center. So I tried to keep this worksheet relatively short and sweet. There's only, I think, 7 questions. Yeah, 7 questions. Not too bad. Not too much. But I would like you to format your responses in the form of like an argumentative paper, like an argumentative short paragraph. It's not going to be a full paragraph because you're answering in these little boxes here. But first, we're going to focus on just a couple figurative examples of figurative language. You're going to give your interpretation on something specific, and then we'll get to our literary criticism practice. So, for example, if I ask you what the central irony of this story is, we remember what irony and symbolism are, right? That's something that is old news. If we don't, let me know, and I can re-go over that. So you'll structure your response in the form of an argumentative piece. You'll write a claim. That's just a statement in response to this question. Very straightforward. You'll provide a quote as evidence, and then you'll explain how that evidence supports your initial claim. So we have symbolism, some of your interpretation, and then we have two examples of feminist criticism, and one for new historicism, one for Marxism. Normally, I would say, hey, I want you to do a Marxist interpretation of this short text. Use any of those questions that I gave you to provide me with an interpretation. For this particular instance, just to get our feet wet, I've kind of taken those questions and reformatted them a little bit and told you which one that's using, just to start out, just to make things a little bit easier. So we're pretty much out of time. I'll address this tomorrow if you guys are having any issues with it. If you're having a hard time understanding the questions, I can go over those tomorrow with you. But we have, in what ways does the power dynamic between husband and wife manifest itself through John and the narrator's interaction? So, like, who has the power? What is the power dynamic like in this relationship? Who has the power? How is that shown? That's essentially all that question is asking. What negative impacts do conforming to traditional gender roles, the gender roles that society is assigning men and women, what negative impacts does that have on both the narrator, who's the protagonist, and her husband, John? How are events, interpretation, and presentation a product of the culture of the author? Most importantly, does the work's presentation support or condemn the event? In this case, we're talking specifically about the rescuer. I think that you can imagine that the work probably doesn't support the rescuer, considering that the author of this short story was subjected to the rescuer herself. And lastly, what social classes do the characters represent? How does this impact the plot or the outcome of the story? It's not going to come out directly and say, these guys are lower class, these guys are middle class, these guys are upper class. You're going to have to kind of deduce that from descriptions of the setting, from descriptions of how these guys are going about their daily lives. Descriptions of the house that they're in, descriptions of maybe the job that the husband has, et cetera, et cetera. So that's it for today. I know lectures aren't the most exciting thing in the world. I try to keep that limited as much as possible, but they are inevitable. So I hope that wasn't too painful for you. And I hope you kind of got a semblance of an understanding of what we just went over today. So, of course, email me with any questions that you may have, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. This is Mr. Sheets signing out.